Then let's directly start with our first speaker, Professor Sara Beery, who came all the way from Boston to be with us today. Formerly a visiting researcher at Google after completing her PhD at Caltech. She's now an assistant professor at MIT. Her research applies cutting-edge computer vision to global biodiversity monitoring and beyond. She's also widely recognized as a leading voice in AI for conservation, having built a community of thousands of people. So now please give a warm welcome to Professor Sara Beery. Sara, the floor is yours.
Hi, guys. Let's see if that works. OK, cool. So I'm very, very happy to be here. And I think it's such a nice reminder whenever I do come to Europe of like what a thriving community there is in Europe in this space. Just like the number of colleagues, familiar faces, connections in this room is really exciting. So you all should feel very, very happy and lucky to be here and be a part of it. So the first thing I do want to say is that I promised Devis, like months ago, that I was going to talk about something very, very different, and then I forgot. And instead, I got really excited about this very recent preprint that I've built with my student that's talking about deep multimodal species occupancy modeling. But it is talking about the distribution of species. And I'm pretty sure Devis is going to talk a lot about the distribution of species. So I think you guys are just going to get a deep dive this morning on why we care about where species are and the many, many different ways that we actually try to think about modeling it. Cool. So this is, like I said, some very recent work. It's also the first time I'm giving this talk, because I just was so excited. So I just made these slides. And I really, really would love feedback from all of you, because I think it's kind of an interesting way to think about these problems. So we want to know where species are. How many of you in this room consider yourselves at least a little bit of an ecologist? OK, great. How many of you are proper ecologists, like you were trained in ecology? OK, cool, cool, cool. Great. This is helpful. You guys are going to be like, wow, she's probably butchering this. OK, so we want to know where species are. And there's a lot of reasons why we might want to know where species are. For example, we might be interested in understanding where we need to put in infrastructure for species. We need to think about basically like where and how you want to build things like this species overpass. And this is mostly to help mitigate some human-wildlife conflict that might happen, or human-wildlife lack of coexistence, we might say, where you end up with things like, basically species not having the right infrastructure to allow them to interact and move through the world safely while navigating an increasingly densely human-populated landscape. We might want to understand things like species population sizes and species abundance so that we can set reasonable quotas for things like hunting, right? So I think this is, of course, something that's quite popular here as well. But in the United States, when I first got into this space, I was like, hunting is evil, right? Like I think a very naive, bleeding heart young person, I was like, we shouldn't kill animals. I still don't love that we have to, but unfortunately we've built ecosystems that are really unstable. In the Northeast, where I now recently live, the mule deer population is pretty devastating to the local ecosystem and to many, many other species. You have these species that are very successful and that eat everything. And essentially, everything is not in balance. And so there is, I think, some need to think about ways to manage ecosystems and populations, and some of that is through hunting. But you also need to ensure that you're not over-hunting, right? We need to make sure that kind of the different populations are as stable as possible. This is really hard to do because this is a very, very complex system, right? We don't really understand all of the different factors well enough. So, we have all these examples of management throughout history. There's a few big ones in Australia, for example, where we introduced a species to fill some sort of habitat niche, and then it maybe didn't go the way that we planned, like the cane toad. Or there's a great example. I've been working a lot in salmon sustainability in the United States. Another management question where we need to decide what the fishing quotas are. Actually, during the salmon runs at every 4 hours, they're making decisions about quotas for fishing. There was a time in the United States where they thought that the reason that the salmon populations were declining was that there was too much stuff in the rivers and they couldn't swim upstream, so they went in and they messed up the entire habitat. They took out all of the trees. They basically like clean scoured. They were like, going to make a nice fresh path. It's like, no, the salmon need all that habitat. They need these spaces to hide, to rest. So we're not always very good at management, but knowing where species are can actually help us understand, hopefully make better decisions in the future about some of the ecosystem management. We need to understand the spread of invasive species. This is a nutria. It's very invasive in the United States, also here in the EU. Understanding kind of how and where and the speed at which invasive species are spreading is really also important, again, from a management perspective. We need to understand when we need to intervene or not. And finally, we'd like to understand the effects of different types of ecosystem impacts, right? So here you can see a pretty significant difference on one side of the road versus another. This was I think logged. I'm not actually sure. But so here, one of the things that we don't necessarily understand is what are the factors that contribute to species change? How do species decide, where to go, or which factors in the environment lead to them leaving or coming back in? This is really important if we're trying to understand both future climate and anthropogenic impacts on species, but also how to understand regeneration of ecosystems. How do we actually introduce the components of a habitat that allow species to come in? So we want to know where species are. One of the ways that we do this is we try to model their distribution. This is pretty straightforward. So we're going to try to model some distribution of the environmental process or the environmental factors. And the simplest way to do this is you try to come up with some description of the habitat in any given place. So here we've made this nice little spatial cube of the environment. We're going to describe that in some way. A simple description could be something just like a land cover or a temperature. And then we're going to try to model the suitability of that habitat for a given species. So we're trying to model basically something about, is this type of habitat suitable for this type of species? And then we fit this using data. And there's two different major types of data that we use to fit distribution models. The first one is presence-only observations. I'll break these down a little bit more in the next slide, but this is the vast majority of species data we have on Earth, are these presence-only observations. And then the other type of data that we use to fit these distribution models are what we call, so traditionally people would say presence-absence, but actually in the literature, people are kind of moving to detection, non-detection. And we'll get into this in a little bit, but basically it's really, really hard to know for sure that something is not there. It's just really difficult. We can say we didn't find it, but that's not the same as truly knowing it's not there. So detection, non-detection, I think, captures some of that nuance a little bit better than just saying absence. All right, so presence-only models are usually built on top of incredible resources coming from very, very large-scale community science data. Now, I don't want anyone to fight me on this. eBird is kind of detection, non-detection, and kind of not. They're checklists, so you go out and you sort of go to some place, and those are opportunistic, like where you do a checklist, and then you report everything you did or didn't find, and so in theory, because you have a full checklist, you're getting a proxy for non-detection. So I get that. That's why it's kind of shifted over on here. Just don't get mad at me if you're like a huge birder who uses eBird all the time and wants to say that this is definitively non-detection. So the inputs here are observations of species presence. And one of the things that's tough, especially if you're building these for iNaturalist, where you don't even have this proxy of non-detection, is it's very hard to tell where and when species weren't. These are really, really common, building these from citizen science, other opportunistically collected data. I would argue that the vast majority of the species distribution modeling that we've seen using AI has been built on top of primarily these types of data. So this is things like the GeoLife clay competition, for example, is really that entire benchmark was built on top of iNaturalist, things like Sapper. We've seen a lot of really cool work trying to predict species distributions from primarily large-scale community science data. So in contrast, occupancy models are usually taking in much more systematic samples of the environment. And these days, those usually come from remote sensors that are static. So the idea is you have like a bioacoustic sensor or a camera trap. It's in a place over a long period of time. And so now you have multiple observations of species presence over that time series. And what this does, this type of systematic long-term spot where you now have multiple observations of presence and non-detection and non-presence, is it helps you build models that can disentangle the probability of the species actually being there from the probability that you saw it. And this lets you then build unbiased estimates of like the true sort of species distributions, or in this case, often this is referred to as species occupancy modeling. These are really common with acoustic and camera trapping surveys. So this is what we've been trying to figure out. Actually, can we do occupancy modeling incorporating deep learning? So now, we talked about this sort of high-level picture of like what you might do with a species distribution model. So now we're going to introduce some sort of description of the habitat that's quite simple, right? So we have, for example, one of these many ecosystem covariates. So here we're looking at average temperature at some spatial resolution where we have average temperature. And that's going to be that description of the habitat that we're going to put in an X. So traditionally, we have these big lists of what are called ecological covariates that are used for these types of models. The problem is a lot of these environmental variables, these covariates, they're often not directly measured on the ground. They'll be interpolated from sometimes faraway measurements, right? So we have very good models of surface temperature, but they're built from a sparse set of surface temperature estimates, and then they're interpolated throughout. And so that means that also, not only are they interpolated, they also tend to be low resolution. So, the pixel size of each of the covariates is probably quite a bit bigger in some cases than what might be influencing an actual species on the ground. And so this means that, they fail to capture these microhabitat conditions. These are things like microclimates, it's things like understanding what's happening below the canopy in a forest, et cetera. Essentially, the argument we have is that the covariates themselves are not actually nuanced enough to be capturing everything we might care about from a habitat that might influence a species' presence or absence. And so this is where we are introducing deep learning into the problem. And we had this idea, and this has been a long-standing passion of mine, that the ground-level data that we're collecting is capturing a lot of information, and we are currently doing a really bad job of using it. So in this landscape, say we have a camera trap, and that camera trap takes photos, like that tells you a lot about what's going on at that point under the canopy, right? And so what we've done is we've said, all right, let's take that, let's use a simple feature extractor to generate a descriptor of that environment, right? Dino v2, we keep that frozen. And so now you have a set of, we'll call them habitat descriptors, that are just coming from the visual features of this camera trap image from the background, right? We're just taking an empty camera trap image where you now have a picture of what it looks like in that specific place. And then, okay, there's also been a lot of really nice work showing that you can take satellite images and predict distributions. So you can actually generate a similar descriptor for the environment coming from high-resolution visual aerial data. And then you can also include all of the traditional covariates. So now you have essentially a much more complex, a much larger, but potentially a more comprehensive description of an environmental feature. And that's going to now be the thing that you model a function over in terms of estimating the suitability of that habitat. Okay, pretty straightforward idea, actually, I think. But I'm excited about this because we'll get into this in a sec, but instead of saying we're just going to predict everything in a feed-forward way, we're thinking about the decades of work in ecology, building out these very complex, very sort of useful, and very rigorous mechanisms for modeling something like species occupancy. And then we're trying to meld with those the extra expressivity that we get from deep learning. And it's the first work that I've seen that's incorporated ground-level features pretty comprehensively into the models, which I'm excited about. It also took us a really long time to figure this out because we tried a bunch of much more fancy machine learning stuff first, and nothing really works very well because you don't have enough spatial distribution. OK, so then how do we actually learn it? So first, we are basically building this occupancy probability. So that's represented here by sigma. And there's this beta transpose x. That beta is fit, right? So these are learned parameters. And then your discrete occupancy state is represented as a Bernoulli distribution over chi. And then you're also going to learn p, which is your probability of detection. So this is also fit here. And then y, which is like the true detection, is that if you actually want to detect a species, the species actually is there, the site needs to be occupied, so z needs to be 1, and the animal needs to be protected, so that your probability of detection needs to be high. This is just standard, very, very vanilla occupancy modeling. OK, so then how do you actually learn this thing, or how do you fit these parameters? So to make a detection, you now take all of your data, you have all of these camera trap images, and you aggregate them into time periods. And then for each time, you say, was there a deer or not? For each space, you say, was there a deer or not? And now you're maximizing the likelihood over all of those labels that are coming from the camera traps. You can generate these from a machine learning model, right? You can get species predictions from the machine learning model directly. And then there's actually been some cool work that simultaneously will try to work with the continuous output scores from those machine learning models and use those continuous scores instead of discrete presence, non-presence in your occupancy models. This is complementary to that work, but we're just going with, let's keep it simple. We use the human labels for all of this data. And then this is the thing that I think all of you will be excited about. I am very excited about. We got really sick of trying to get machine learning libraries to play nicely with statistical libraries in R. And so we built out the first kind of end-to-end code base that's pretty easy to use, where you can define, fit, and evaluate your occupancy models entirely in Python. And we're building out, adding other model types. We're also very open. If you have like your favorite model and you'd like to add it to this library, we're super open to pull requests. It's fully Bayesian MCMC inference, and it supports GPU acceleration and automatic differentiation via JAX. And the point here is to just start trying to really bridge these gaps between statistical ecology and ML. Because everything is in Python, it means that we can set up now, and we haven't done this yet, but I'm quite excited to think about like how can you actually possibly learn to update your feature representations based on what is useful for occupancy. So removing those frozen feature representations that we currently have, which is really only possible if everything is end-to-end differentiable in some way. Cool. So play with our code. I'm excited about it. We also made a fun little tutorial last year for the Ecological Society of America, where we showed how you can take raw camera trap data, generate predictions from machine learning models, estimate essentially your probability of detection for the machine learning results, and then directly predict occupancy all in one code base. Cool. So how do you evaluate whether this is working? This is where it gets interesting, right? Evaluation is always the hard part because we don't know the ground truth. You can easily say, that is definitely a deer. What you can't easily say is, was there a deer in this place and time? Because of this, this inability to understand true absence. So what we've done is we've built a sort of training set for these models that's based on wildlife insights data. And then we build a test set that covers 16 different species that are reasonably prevalent, included in the training set. And we built the test set entirely on fully public data from Snapshot USA. If you're here in Europe, there is Snapshot Europe. You could think about doing something very similar. And then the metric that we actually use for evaluation, oh, and one very important point here also, these things are entirely independent. So none of the test locations were included in the training data, and we made sure that there was at least 10 kilometers separation between any test sites and training sites to try to avoid any spatial autocorrelation that might be introduced. Cool. Now, what metric do we use? Again, we don't know the true occupancy, right? We only have observations of present detection and non-detection. So instead, what we're going to do is we're really pulling this from the literature and occupancy modeling, but we just want to see how well our model predicts observations at held-out sites. And so we're using this log pointwise. Fuck. I forget. It was in my speaker notes, but they're not up on the slide. So anyway, LPPD, which I've just been saying is LPPD all the time, but it's a very, very, it's a somewhat newer, I think it was like introduced in 2013, but it's become a really prevalent evaluation metric for occupancy modeling. Essentially what you're doing here is you're looking at your likelihood of observation for a given spatial point, and you also have your model, and so now you're looking at your likelihood of observation given your model parameters, and then you're just going to sum that over all your posterior samples, and then sum that over all your sites. And then, so the tricky thing is that the absolute value of LPPD is really difficult to interpret, right? Like, it doesn't really mean anything. The numbers are really difficult to understand. And so what we're doing is we're normalizing that to a 0-1 scale that we're defining, where 0 is defined by the null, which is essentially like constant occupancy, and the 1 is defined by what an oracle would predict, which is essentially a model that's been directly fit on your test data. So how predictive is each modality in terms of introducing it into our habitat descriptions? This is kind of like the interesting results. So this is what you get from traditional occupancy modeling. This is taking your coarse environmental features, and we're looking at the average LPPD on the test set normalized, and this is averaged over all the 16 different species. So that's just using environmental covariates. If you move to using satellite data as your habitat descriptions, you get a pretty nice boost. If you combine those two, so you're actually combining these covariates with satellite data, you can see similarly, there's like a nice, like, healthy benefit that comes from that. So even just using satellite representations as your habitat descriptors is clearly beneficial. Now, what if you use that ground level imagery, this like multi-modality? So if you just use the ground level images, you're already still doing better than if you use your traditional environmental covariates. If you add in the satellite features, again, it's like slightly better. Interestingly here, like, oh, no, sorry, this is image and environment. So if you're adding in those environmental features, you do it basically as well as you do with satellite data. If you take just the satellite and the image features, you're not actually including these traditional covariates. Again, now you're doing better than sort of what we'd ever seen previously. And by combining all three, you kind of do best. I mean, this is like a little intuitive. All of them are capturing different information, right? Just from an information theory perspective, there's some similarity across these different things, but they are capturing different information. One thing that we found that's very interesting here for all of you guys doing Earth observation, the representation that we used for that satellite data mattered very little. Everyone's got their newest, biggest, boldest, we spent millions of dollars training this massive thing. They all are the same. And they're all pretty similar to using something like Dino v3. So I would say that we're not necessarily doing either we've captured all the information there is in satellite data, which I feel like is probably not true, or we just don't have the right training mechanisms yet to actually capture like the depth of the information that is in those satellite features, or that satellite image data. There's a nice paper in the figure in the supplementary material where you basically see like, okay, like Alpha Earth, Tessera, Galileo, Prithvi, like they're all basically the same. So I think this is cool though, because I feel like this means that maybe we can try to build better habitat suitability features, and now we have like a really nice systematic way to evaluate it that's quite rigorous. If we actually break this down across species, most of the time you're getting like pretty nice benefits. It's interesting, there's a few of these species down here that that often the ones that actually are occurring in forests, where from the canopy, everything looks really the same, you're seeing a lot more benefit of having that ground level data because it's capturing something you just can't see from above the canopy. But we also had one species, the white-tailed antelope squirrel, where this was horrible. It actually made it much, much worse. And when we dug into this, essentially what we found is that just for that species in particular, the difference between our train and test data was pretty big. We had a really large distribution shift between the ecological, the environmental features in the image space and in the covariate space between what train and test was. So this does seem to suggest that it is important to kind of capture the distribution in your training data, in the data you're fitting on, and that extrapolation is still a challenge, right? Being able to truly extrapolate sort of to some, we fit all of this in North America. If we ran these models in Europe, they'd be trash, basically. So the one thing that then you lose from traditional occupancy modeling is now, it's never causality, but people want to treat it like causality, right? You want to be able to say high temperature means species occupancy. But now you're using these deep features that are really non-interpretable, right? So we also try to think about what is the different mechanism to think about explainability that we can build here. And what we did was we looked at, for any given species, can we look at which ground level images had the most significant positive or negative influence on the likelihood of occupancy, right? So basically, where are we seeing these ground level features change the decision the most relative to just using above ground features? And we see some really interesting stuff here, right? So the ground level features that seem to most contribute to occupancy for this western gray squirrel are forest landscapes, seem to be relatively moist, and they also are not super densely vegetated in the undergrowth. Sure. And then the negative influence is much more desert scale landscapes, drier forests, et cetera. I think this is interesting. I think that I was also really surprised by how excited the ecologists we worked with were about this. Because they started immediately sort of saying, oh, actually, this matches our intuition for this species. There's some literature that you can point to that's talking about these types of preferences. Now, of course, this is just scratching the surface here, right? It's just a suggestion for how we might try to bring in more interpretability into a model that we've made more black box. But we did a similar thing for coyotes, and there, I think one of the things that was really interesting was that we kept getting, in these positive influence ones, pictures of roads that were non-paved. There's like 2 here, but there's quite a few. And this actually turns out to match the literature. So coyotes are known in the literature to prefer unpaved roads as a mechanism for transportation. And okay, yeah, and we do. When I think about the camera trap images I've worked with, you get a lot of coyotes on unpaved roads. But this is like a fun, we're not showing images of coyotes on unpaved roads, this model at all, right? We're just learning the features that are corresponding to coyote presence. So I think this is kind of fun. And I'm excited to kind of dig in a little bit more. The other interesting thing is that things like human infrastructure tend to show up as a negative likelihood of occupancy. One of the things that I have mixed feelings about that my student wants to try is, now can we use language models to describe the features that are most likely to show up in sort of these sets of most positive or most negative influence? I think it could be interesting. Could also be a bit of a gimmick. But for beavers, for example, there's a really nice comprehensive set for the state of California of super fine-grained habitat traits. And we are seeing a lot of synonyms between this list of traits that a human would look for in terms of beaver habitat and what we're actually seeing influencing the probability of detection. Cool. So overall, we're really trying to think about how to develop multimodal pre-training objectives for habitat representation. How do we build a more nuanced description of the habitats that we're trying to model? We're trying to come up with different creative ways to leverage all of these different modalities of data that we have, right? I think we should be using the ground level data when we have it. It's truly new information relative to what we can see from space. We're trying to embrace sort of modern machine learning methods, but build this into the traditional frameworks in ecology. And I also think this prioritization of interpretability is pretty important. And I'm really excited in terms of this. One of the kind of obvious next steps is we're starting to build these out with bioacoustic models. One of the things that's very interesting is then this question of like, what is the description of a bioacoustic model? We're also talking about trying to incorporate more of the time dimension, because with camera traps, you have all these ground level photos over time. We're currently using just a single image as a representation, but it makes total sense to try to actually capture this additional information about how that habitat is changing over time. Cool. I'd be happy to take a couple questions. I think I have some time. Do I have time? Yes, great, okay. And if you want to read the preprint, it's up there. I put a QR code.
Great, such a great talk. So we have a microphone that we can circulate. If anyone has any question, please feel free to raise your hand. Okay, we have one over there maybe.
Thank you very much for the talk. I'm wondering, you mentioned that you tried different machine learning methods and many of them didn't work. What were there? This is really curious because people usually don't tell about this, and the book is published is what has worked. So I'm really curious what wasn't working.
Yeah, I mean, we did a lot of like thinking about different ways to try to improve the multimodal representations beyond just taking frozen features. So these were like different types of contrastive pre-training or different mechanisms of like encoding and learning across modalities. I don't think that they could never work. I think that the big challenge with this is just scale, right? Like, and we had to be really thoughtful to make sure that we weren't overfitting. Especially as you increase the dimensionality of your description of the habitat, there's a very, very high likelihood that you could essentially just memorize in some way that's actually unhelpful and reduces generalization. So when you're in this kind of space where like the set of parameters that you're fitting is small, but your input descriptor can be quite big, you have to essentially be thoughtful about how to reduce overfitting. But I'm still really excited about thinking about how to improve those features. But, okay, so there's a lot of recent work, like a great example is this paper called Taxobind, where they sort of they took like the image bind approach and then they just like scaled it to a bunch of different types of features. I think one of the biggest limitations of that type of approach is that you're learning a shared representation across modalities, which almost by construction means that you're going to learn to ignore the things that are unique to each modality. This makes sense, it's helpful if you have image and language, right? But if you have less overlap between what you're seeing from satellite and what you're seeing from the ground, essentially it's almost like muddying the signal. And so then we were looking at some of these like disentangled methods for contrastive pre-training where you have separable features that are shared and not shared. Anyway, nothing worked that well. So we were like, let's keep it simple, get it out there, and then we can keep working on it.
Okay, any other question? Maybe you already spotted someone.
Yeah, first of all, thank you for the great talk. I have a question regarding generalization. So you already mentioned that if you train this model on North American data and then you deploy it on Europe, this doesn't generalize quite well. So
yeah, I mean, it's statistics, right? So like extrapolation and statistics has always been hard.
Right. So how does this work regarding data recency? So let's say you train the model, take the model that you trained today, and you evaluate this in 10 years, and the environment might change quite a bit in those next 10 years. So do you have any feeling for how this might affect the models?
Yeah, so this is actually interesting. I think what it wouldn't generalize to is if the species preferences for habitat change. But if the habitat itself changes, but the species preferences for habitat don't change, then what you've learned actually should generalize quite well, right? So for example, what we were talking about, like coyotes are preferring to walk on unpaved roads. If there's now a new unpaved road in a location, you have that captured in a feature, that's going to increase the probability that the coyote would be there. What's going to not extrapolate is if actually somehow coyotes start to not prefer unpaved roads, right? So, I mean, in terms of that extrapolation to Europe or something, I think I don't know. I think essentially you have to have some distribution of the types of landscapes or habitats that a species may show up in so that you can learn what it does or does not prefer. And if those preferences stay reasonably same, then it should generalize better in future years. But if the preferences themselves change, which there's reason to believe that they do as the habitat and landscape changes, so for example, if there's coyotes in an area, if they stay instead of leaving when there's more humans that come in, they're going to change their preferences because they have to adapt to a new landscape. So then it might not generalize in those cases. Yeah.
Other questions, maybe? Yeah, many different ones. Maybe woman in red.
Thank you so much. I actually have so many questions, but I'll go with one. One of the challenges about conservation and management in Europe is actually, I mean, when you compare with the US, it's way more smaller areas. How do you think your spatial resolution, if we make it like super small instead of whole United States, but just like one county, even like one farmland, do you think how your model would perform?
Yeah, so I actually think that this is where having those ground level features, and thinking about how to incorporate them, this was one of my initial inspirations for this, was basically we can model distributions at a global scale, but we need to take conservation management action at local scales. And so we have done some of these experiments if you're looking at areas where you have very dense sort of camera trap placement in national parks, et cetera. And we do see a much more sort of nuanced predictions of where those species are going to be at those smaller resolutions. The challenge is you can't fit the models with these kind of deep features if you're only fitting them on that data. So there's kind of like a scale trade-off. So what we found is that if you're fitting the models on kind of US scale data, but you have some of these denser areas in there where you're capturing more of the ground level features, then you can actually do evaluation on local scale landscapes and you do see improvement. But I think I don't think that there's, basically you just can't break statistics. If you don't have enough data to build a good statistical estimate, you just don't have enough data. But actually, this is also where I think the time series part is going to get really interesting. Some of our local partners, they haven't been at the area of a farm. It's more like states. So the state of Idaho, for example, they have I want to say several thousand camera traps placed across the state of Idaho, and they're collecting something like 20 million images a year. We've been partnering with them for, close to a decade, with first Megadetector, now SpeciesNet, and sort of moving into thinking about some of their occupancy modeling. I'm quite excited about this type of approach, particularly because it's so forested in terms of having a more nuanced prediction of occupancy for some of their species of interest, like wolves. But yeah, I think the data trade-off is interesting. And I think it's the difference between having data for pre-training versus evaluation, and being able to kind of learn these relationships between these deep features and occupancy for a given species. If your species is super rare, it's still very, very difficult regardless, right? And there's been some work that seems to suggest that we're getting these kind of co-benefits by co-training on many, many species, which I think is exciting, but that is still not something that people can do statistically. We don't see scaling to 10,000 species simultaneously in a multi-species occupancy model. That's just not something that anyone can do. And that's something that taking these purely deep learning approaches and just directly predicting something like species distribution can do. So I think there's still a lot to figure out in terms of how all of these things play together and how we kind of get solutions that are actionable on the ground at resolutions that are relevant to managers, as well as potentially being globally useful enough to think about global policy. And that cross-scale mismatch, I think, is still going to be a challenge for a while. But I'm really excited about being able to incorporate ground level features to improve even local scale occupancy estimates, because I think there's so much that we see in these ground level images or in these ground level acoustic signals that you just aren't going to get from coarse covariates.
Yeah, thank you very much for the presentation and the model. I think that's fantastic work. I also have many questions, but I will keep it to one on the side of missing data. Yeah, and because perhaps I missed it in the presentation, the part, but I wanted to ask, like, different data sources or different data or observational sources capture different species in a different way, right? Like it's, we have perhaps bioacoustic data is much better fitted to one species and to another to monitor it. And so the way data may be missing might be at random on the one case and not at random in the other. And I wanted to ask, how is that built into the model? Or, yeah.
I wouldn't say it's built into the model in any intelligent way yet, but also so far the model we're using is really just looking at species that you do capture in camera traps and looking at using camera traps as these environmental descriptors. I think this is a really interesting question when you start to introduce other modalities of data. One of the things I've been thinking about a lot is like propagation of signal on the ground. So currently, this approach is really tied to the availability of a ground level image. And there's a lot of ways to think about scaling that, right? You could, there's a lot of iNaturalist data we've been playing around with where like, if it's a picture of a bird in the sky, that's not very useful in terms of describing an environment. But if it's a picture that has habitat in the background, it can be. And so how far away from a place is a ground level photo or a ground level acoustic signal still useful? And how do you kind of build that into the model? And I think that'll be interesting because a lot of the places we work at, especially these like smaller scale kind of like managed ecosystems where you're trying to actually make management decisions, you'll have a network of camera traps. You might also have a network of bioacoustic data. Maybe they go out and sample eDNA. Maybe sometimes they fly LiDAR from a drone, but it's like once every 2 years. You have all of these different modalities of data, but they're very heterogeneous, right? Like they're not co-located. And most of the multimodal work that we've seen in AI, it just assumes this like simple co-registration of modalities of data. And so what you're asking, I think, begs a much bigger question, which is that when you have different modalities of data that aren't explicitly co-registered and aren't necessarily capturing the same information about a landscape or about the species that are present in it, what is the right way to combine them? The simple thing that I would try first probably is just like, take the different sensors, and now you have like a probability. You're going to have detections, non-detections for a set of species for each type of sensor, and come up with some like simple rule about like radius, and then sort of assign those to these different other complementary sensors as well. I think that that won't work all the way, but it probably is like a reasonable starting point. But I think for now, I might just, if you're really interested in birds, for example, and you have a bunch of bioacoustic sensors, try to just directly model it from that. And then we'll keep working on this question of like, how do you combine camera trap data and bioacoustic data to generate these habitat descriptions, but not bias your actual signal that you're trying to model as well. Tough problems.
Okay, thank you very much, Sarah. We have a small gift for you from the organizing team.
Thank you.
And let's give again like a warm applause to Sara Beery for a great talk. Thank you.